So, Dr. Sad, thank you so much for joining us. You are a professor at Concordia University, actually just near me, and coincidentally, that is where my fiance is studying, and he actually hopes to be studying psychology. But you're someone who you're on YouTube, you give interviews like this, you're on Twitter, and you're definitely not shy with your opinions, which I think we all know in this day and age can kind of be a dangerous thing. And I think recently you've actually had some pushback, some people going after your job, your position at the university because of your opinions. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so 2 days ago I posted some opinions, both on Twitter, and then I did a SAAD TRUTH clip where I weighed in on the behavior of Serena Williams in the final of the US Open. And of course, some people started writing, "You're a racist, you're a sexist," because of course I'm critiquing a black woman, but that's fine. But then one woman decided to take it much further. She thought that my pronouncing an opinion on a famous tennis player was sufficient of a affront to her meaning the person who's, the random stranger, that she should try to get me fired from my position at Concordia. So she started tagging my university, reporting me to the university. Well, I decided, of course, to fight back against this just intellectual terrorist, this execrable cretin. And of course, then people started going after her, not through me trying to get them to go after her, but because people were rightly indignant that this person could actually do this, at which point she decided to close her Twitter account. She then wrote to me the next day from a new account saying, "You better remove my tweets or else I'm going to sue you for defamation." So let's step back and analyze this. A random person tries to fire a full professor because he aired a position about a tennis player. When she fails in her attempt to end my career, she is the victim. This is what we're dealing with today.
And I think that's something we see so commonly nowadays. If you disagree with someone, it's not enough to just say, "I think you're wrong, whatever, I disagree with this." There's a lot of trying to go after people's positions nowadays, whether it's, I guess, activists trying to go over people's sponsors when it comes to people like Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham. And when it comes to professors like you, and I think Dr. Jordan Peterson has also had this fair share, it's kind of frightening, right? Because you would think if there would be one position where difference of thought and opinions would be encouraged, it would be in academia, it would be among our professors. Is this the first time that you've actually had people try to go after your position? Because, as someone who talks about evolutionary psychology, I don't understand it, but it seems like that's a field that gets a lot of attention and a lot of criticism, a lot of controversy when it comes to people saying, "Oh, that's sexist." So has this happened to you before?
Yeah, so it's happened in several ways. I had a guy last year who lived in Australia start engaging me on Twitter. I found him very obnoxious and insulting. So at one point, I think I called him a degenerate, retarded schmuck. And so he decided to first try to rally the Twitter mob after me because apparently my saying degenerate meant that I was homophobic. I had no idea who this guy was. I didn't know if he was male or female, let alone what his sexual orientation was. But somehow degenerate was a code word for my latent homophobia. So then when he wasn't successful in rallying the Twitter mob, he contacted my university, started tagging them. When that wasn't enough, he actually, I guess, directly contacted the HR department at my university, and they tried to contact me to sort of discuss the issue, to which I answered to them, "Let me get this straight. You're contacting me after hours to try to monitor and ask me questions about how I engage with another individual on my personal Twitter account, and that person lives in Australia? Is that what you're doing right now?" So when they realized that that was not a good look for them, they dropped it. But to answer your question, yes, I've had several people, not always trying to go after me for my job, although that's happened, but for taking any position, whether it be in my scientific career, as you said, as an evolutionary psychologist, or if I weigh in on Islam or the transgender issue or the political correctness. So there are an endless litany of reasons why people get offended, and then since they can't literally execute you in the West, then let's execute him by ending his career, by threatening his reputation. So it's really grotesque and it has to stop.
And I think something that I'm sad to say happens a lot is that oftentimes employers and specifically universities they will agree that this behavior is out of line, maybe it does warrant some kind of punishment. Has Concordia University, and you can be as open as you choose to be, but have they been fairly I guess supportive of you, not necessarily your views, but you being able to say what it is that you believe, to pursue whatever field of study you want? How have they been in terms of allowing you the academic freedom as a professor?
They certainly have never been anything less than wonderful in absolutely never putting any bounds as to what I can or can't study. I have never had any inclination from anyone that my research in evolutionary psychology was a problem to anyone, as it shouldn't be, because there is no other game in town other than understanding that the mind has evolved through the process of evolution. Mm-hmm. So if you do have a problem with evolutionary psychology, you also belong to the Flat Earth Society Club. So in that sense, I've had no problems. Where I think Concordia could be much better is in actually being forceful in demonstrating that they support people like me who are at the forefront of trying to fight for ideals that should be a no-brainer in a free society. And on that front, I'm afraid that they haven't been very forthcoming in supporting me. So they leave me alone. They don't necessarily put any obstacles in my way, but they certainly have tried to disassociate themselves from some of my public engagements, which frankly is regrettable because they should be hailing what I do rather than ignoring it.
Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, because when it comes to college campuses, we see that there's often a lot of, I guess, controversy surrounding free speech, not necessarily just of what the professors are saying, but also what kind of groups are allowed on campus to operate and what kind of speakers are invited. What's the climate like in around Concordia? Are they fairly open about allowing different groups, whether it's college Republicans, libertarian groups, whatever sorts of groups, to assemble and invite their own speakers, or do we see a situation perhaps like we saw maybe at Evergreen or UC Berkeley, oftentimes when if there is a controversial speaker, the administration kind of hunkers down and says, I don't know about this. Let's talk about it. Administrative excuse after the fact, and just trying to, I guess, forestall it until eventually you give up. Because I think we've seen that a lot. It's almost like a soft blocking.
Exactly. A few years ago, well, now many years ago, maybe about 13, 14 years ago, at the time I was at University of California, Irvine, on a leave. I remember that Concordia had stopped Benjamin Netanyahu, who was and still is the Prime Minister of Israel, from speaking at Concordia. So there certainly are precedents at Concordia of very high-profile people being stopped from speaking. In terms of my personal experience, the one that comes to mind is the following. A few years ago, I had thought of organizing a freedom summit where I would invite, leading academics who are at the forefront of, fighting all the campus lunacy. And at the time, I think I might have first publicly announced it during my first chat with Jordan Peterson when he had first come on my show a few years ago. And I'd said, well, I'll invite you, meaning Jordan, Janice Fiamingo, Jonathan Haidt, a whole bunch of other folks who are really at the forefront of fighting this stuff, to come to a freedom summit to discuss the importance of academic freedom. And I can assure you that my university was not very keen on this idea, which again is breathtaking, because you would think that someone with my profile, who is connected to other people who are also of very high profile, all of whom are fighting for the most fundamental ideals of a free and liberal society, you would think the university would be very keen on supporting that. Apparently they weren't.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who, like you said, talks about issues like evolutionary psychology, which in some senses can be, I don't want to say problematic because it shouldn't be, but for a lot of people, when you talk about the innate differences between, let's say, men and women that have emerged throughout evolution as us needing to, I guess, specialize in certain tasks, divide and conquer when it comes to either hunter-gathering, managing the family, and stuff like that, do you fear that I guess the more the progressive influence begins to infiltrate academia, that eventually fields of studies like yours will be barred. Because for the longest time, the humanities have it's just been known that there are things you can say, things you can't say, areas you can study, and areas you cannot. But I think for a lot of people in STEM and even more the social sciences to an extent when it comes to something like evolutionary psychology, and I would say something like just general psychology as well, it's always been a little bit more, I don't want to say academic because I'm a political science major, or I was, that's academic too, but there has been this more element of hard science attached to that has sort of acted as, I think, as a buffer to what could be called editorial review or control of the narrative. Do you think that the longer this goes on, the more, I guess, what would once be considered hard science will be called into question? Like, I mean, can we really say that there are differences between males and females? Are women really less aggressive than men? Is that all just nurture? What's that going to look like in the future?
Look, I think there is a very long list of detractors of evolutionary psychology, not just the folks in the humanities and the social sciences. Religious people don't like evolutionary psychology for obvious reasons. Postmodernists won't like evolutionary psychology because there are supposedly no universal truths, whereas, of course, evolutionary psychology does recognize that there are human universals. Radical feminists don't like evolutionary psychology because, as you said, there are supposedly no innate sex differences and so on. So the list of detractors is very long, but all the reasons for their antipathy towards evolutionary psychology is always rooted in ideological dogma. In other words, it's not so much that they have scientific arguments to resist evolutionary psychology. It's because evolutionary psychology shakes the foundations of their ideological edifice. And so the reality is that science is an autocorrective process. With enough evidence, all the stupidity and idiocy washes out. And so some of the people who 20 years ago were some of my biggest detractors now send me emails saying, "Oh, it would be an honor, Professor Saad, to have you speak at our class, at our university." Well, what happened that 20 years ago I was a moron in your books, whereas now I'm your hero? Well, it's because enough evidence has been accumulated for my positions that they could no longer deny it. So I think science is the great, if you like, it's the light that shines the truth on things. And so if you're patient enough, all those schmucks will eventually die out, at least in the academic context. So I hold out hope, but the battle is very fierce because as they see that their ideological edifices are being squashed, they will scream and fight that much harder. And that's why you get some of the stuff like what I discussed earlier. They're losing the battle of ideas, and therefore they'll go out kicking and screaming.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think evolutionary psychology, I guess, can relate to the amount of identity politics that we're seeing today, right? Because it's this kind of, I've heard people who are very staunch progressives, very in favor of identity politics, talk about things that are supported by evolutionary psychology, such as, I guess, in-group preferences, right? They'll use that to enforce the idea that there is this systemic racial oppression going on in the West. As someone who has obviously looked at the numbers, studied this data over years and years and years, what would you say to that? Is that something that we can apply to our current society that we're living in, or is the idea of in-group preference is just a more general thing that we might see among different, like, religious groups, yes, family groups, any type of grouping that isn't necessarily indicative of this systemic racial oppression that's, sort of white people versus everyone else?
Look, identity politics is a manifestation of our innate penchant for coalitional thinking, right? Mm-hmm. It's very easy for people to view the world as us versus them, blue team versus red team. I mean, that's the strength of many religious narratives, right? So if you look at all the Abrahamic religions, whether it be in Judaism, there are the Jews and the Goys. In Islam, there is the believers and the kuffar, the infidel. In Christianity, there are those who accept Jesus and are going to heaven, and the rest of us are going to languish in hell. So it's easy for people to buy into narratives where you divide the world into very clean lines of demarcation of us versus them. And ultimately, that's what identity politics plays on. It takes that innate desire for tribalism and it puts it on steroids. Now, I tell people, if you wish to instantiate your desire to belong to a tribe, belong to the tribe of truth. So, for example, when people ask me, we can't exactly tell what your political bent is, Dr. Saad. Are you a liberal? Are you a conservative? Are you this? And then usually I say, I am a man of ideas. On some issues, if I tell you my position, you'll think I am the most rabid liberal. On other issues, you'll think I'm conservative. When it comes to, for example, immigration policy, I don't think we should have open border policies. Well, that makes me, quote, a conservative. When it comes to social issues, I'm the most liberal guy in the world, and you would think I'm a staunch liberal. So just belong to the tribe of truth. Use your ability to think, to navigate through ideas. Don't belong to tribes. Pursue the truth, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to, you've mentioned postmodernists, why do you think they attack the idea of truth so fiercely? Because, I'm someone who, I like to have data to support my ideas. I like to have the hard sciences to at least kind of corroborate what I'm saying. And I understand there are things like social constructs. There is some degree of, I guess, subjectivity when it comes to certain things, but I'm also a firm believer in things like biology, in things like, to some extent as well, objective morality, especially when we're talking about things like equality and human rights. Why do you think the idea of, it's almost a sort of nihilistic relativist worldview is becoming so popular, and especially among young people and academics right now? Because I feel like the idea, when you make definitive statements, even if it's something as simple as there are two genders, something which we have held as gospel for the longest time, now that essentially makes you a bigot. Where is that hatred for what could be called truth coming from? Because I see it all the time, and it's pretty rampant when you think of it. This wasn't around, I think, 15 years ago.
So there are many ways to answer this. Let me give you one or two of the reasons, although the conversation as to why postmodernism has arisen requires a much longer answer. Look, in a sense, it's, quote, liberating to be a postmodernist, right? When you are not shackled by this thing called reality, then you could be anything, anywhere, anytime, right? So let me give you a quick example. The empty slate premise, which basically says we're born with, tabula rasa, empty slate, and then I could make any child grow up to be anything. He could be a Nobel Prize winner, he could be an NBA star, is a very liberating. It's a very hopeful message, right? Really? So I can grow up to be the next Michael Jordan? Well, the reality is no, I can't grow up to be the next Michael Jordan because I'm not 6'6" and I don't have the ability to jump the way that he does, and no amount of nurturing from my mom and hugging from my dad will ever get me there, right? But it's a very liberating, it's a very hopeful message to think that any of us could be anything were it not for the shackles of socialization and the unique trajectories of our lives. Right. In a sense, postmodernism does something similar. It says that there is no objective truth. Everything is subjective, so anything at any time could be potentially true. And I'll give you one great story that some of your viewers might have heard me mention before, others not, so it's worth repeating here. I once had a conversation with a radical feminist who was also a postmodernist, and when I challenged her to the idea as to whether I might be able to propose a human universal to her, and she could tell me whether I'm wrong or not, and she accepted that challenge, I asked her whether it were true that for Homo sapiens, for humans, only women bear children. Was that not a human universal? And this is in 2002, I think. So this was before the whole transgender, gender pronoun issue. And she said, absolutely not. That's not a human universal. I said, well, what do you mean? She goes, well, there is some tribe in Japan, off some island, where the tribe, the Buga Buga tribe, or whatever they were called, in their spiritual realm, it is the men who bear children. So you see what a sexist pig you are? By restricting the conversation to the materialist, biological realm, this is how you keep us pregnant and barefoot in the kitchen. So when this woman wasn't able to admit that only women bear children, we have a problem. And so it is what you said. It is nihilistic, or as I call it, it's intellectual. It's intellectual terrorism, right? Today is 9/11. The 9/11 terrorists flew planes into buildings. Well, what postmodernists do is fly bullshit into our buildings of reason.
Right. Well, on that very descriptive, very, I guess, imaginative note, where can people find you? You have a YouTube channel. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Or, if you're on Twitter, where can people go to keep up with what you're doing?
Oh, thank you for asking that. So my YouTube channel is called The SAAD Truth, SAAD, The SAAD Truth. For those who are going to subscribe shortly, you have about 720 episodes to catch up, so that'll keep you busy for the next few years. You can also follow me on Twitter at GAD, GAD, and I also have a public Facebook page, so you can follow me there as well.
Great. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Thanks.